What do we need God for? That's what we're thinking about this evening. What do we need God for? A person might say, I can get along quite fine without God. I read a book on breathing recently, and now I know a lot more about breathing than I once did. And I know what happens in the body when we breathe fast, when we breathe slow, when we breathe deep, when we breathe shallow. We breathe through our left nostril. Apparently that has a different impact than when we breathe through our right nostril. Who knew? But a person might say, well, I don't need to know anything about that. I'm living my life fine without knowing. They might even say, I don't believe any of that stuff. But yet, they're still breathing. They may seem to function just fine without knowing why they do what they do, without knowing how it is that they breathe, but they're still needing to do what they do. There's a guy called Glenn Scrivener who wrote a great book called The Air We Breathe. And his argument is that the values we have today in our world of compassion and equality and progress and science and freedom and consent are all Christian values that grow out of Christianity. And just today, as I was driving back from Milford this morning, I was listening to a podcast, and it had a great clip from a debate that I had watched previously. It's between A.C. Grayling, who is an atheist philosopher, and Tom Holland, who is an atheist historian. And A.C. Grayling said this: I would ask Tom this, and this is a surprising question maybe. You'll find that it wasn't really remotely surprising to Tom Holland. To nominate for me just one thing that Christianity has introduced that doesn't have some source, some parallel in previous and in other civilizations. One novelty, one innovation in thinking about anything you like. I must say, I've racked my brains over this often enough, and I cannot think of one, and I would love to hear if there is one. Do you accept my challenge? Tom Holland: absolutely. I think the ideal of lifelong matrimony, I think that's a very distinctive Christian concept. I think the category of what by the 19th century is coming to be categorized as homosexuality, heterosexuality, that has no precedent. I think that the notion of secularism, the idea of there being different religions, I think all these are entirely exclusive to Christian civilization. I think that the concept of science, as it emerges in the 19th century, I think it is entirely exclusive to Christian civilization. I think that the idea that human beings are created in the image of God, that is obviously something that Christians share with Jews, but that is, it gives a degree of dignity to human beings that no other cultural tradition that I'm aware of even remotely approximates to. There, he just rattled off 5 off the top of his head. And then he says, so I think all of those. And essentially what I'm talking in giving that, what I'm talking about in giving that, is what I'm talking about, he says, is what makes Western civilization distinctive. You see, all of those things, and many more things, were not part and parcel of the ancient world. They were things that largely grew as Christianity began to have more and more impact. And one of the reasons behind doing this evening is more of an apologetics talk, is to give you, and particularly our young people, confidence that the people around us are beginning to discover that Christianity and belief in God is the foundation of everything. Nothing makes sense without Him. I want us to have confidence that this is God's world and that things only make sense when we believe in Him. Things are the way they are because He is the way He is. The cover of New Scientist magazine in 2021 had a list of questions. Why do we exist? Why do we grieve? Why are we irrational? Why are we conscious? Why is there something rather than nothing? Why is the universe intelligible? Why are we good and evil? Why is the universe just right? It's 13 of the most profound questions about the universe and us. And you open up the magazine, there are answers given. But those answers are loaded with maybe, possibly, could be. There's nothing certain or definite about them. And so this evening I want to give us, in reasonably rapid fashion, hopefully, 8 ways that God is the foundation of everything. 8 fruits, 8 fruits that grow on the tree of God. So here is our tree, and we're going to have, don't worry, we'll show the masterpiece to those up here. We're going to have a number of fruit that grow on it, but the roots down here. Oh, if I could write as well as draw, it would be helpful. So here's our tree with our fruits, and here are the roots that are in God, and we're going to consider that. And if God isn't there, how do we explain these fruit that grow on the tree? Everybody can enjoy the fruit. You don't have to be a Christian to enjoy the fruit, but not everybody can explain them. And that's what people like Tom Holland are starting to say. They're going, hold on a minute, that grows on the tree of Christianity. Other writers, Ayaan Hirsi Ali and Louise Perry, use the phrase, we've been living in a cut flower society. They're saying, in a sense, well, if we had a cut tree society, we'd have cut the tree down, and then we'd wonder why the fruit are dying. We're wondering why these things that our sense of right and wrong, our sense of fairness and equality, why we're becoming an increasingly divided society, because those things grew on the tree of Christianity, and we've tried to chop that down in the West. If there's no God, all we've got is a bunch of levitating fruit. So we've now no tree. Or we've got a magic fruit tree. One of the two. So let me give you 8 things. First of all, remember one of those questions was, why is there something rather than nothing? And I'm going to have a fruit, and I don't know that I'm going to write beside every single. It will go, exist. Why do we exist? Why is there something rather than nothing? God is the foundation of existence. Up until the last 100 years, many scientists believed that the universe was eternal. They assumed it would always been there. And then the evidence started to show otherwise about 100 years ago. Edwin Hubble in 1927 showed that the galaxies were moving away from us. And that provided confirmation for the theory of relativity and confirmation that the idea that the universe had a beginning. And a lot of scientists didn't like that. One great physicist, Arthur Eddington, said, "The notion of a beginning to the present order of nature is repugnant to me." He didn't like it. He didn't like it because he knew that if something has a beginning, it needs to have what? Young people. Something has a beginning, what does it need to have? Somebody that begins it, somebody that starts it. And he didn't like that idea because then you've got to have a God. But now the evidence was pointing to this, that there was a beginning. Yet the Bible had said for thousands of years, in the beginning. In the beginning, God created everything. And you see, if there's a God, that makes sense of this fruit of existence. It can be traced down to a God who exists, a God who has always been there, a God who has no beginning and has no end. So God can answer the question, why is there something rather than nothing? Second thing that we've got a foundation to here, God is the foundation for consciousness. I think you're all conscious. Are you conscious? You sure? You're definitely conscious. Is that door jamb conscious? You sure? How do you know? It's not what? It's not breathing. If I hold my breath underwater, that's suddenly become If I hold it too long, I will become unconscious. That's for sure. But one of the big questions scientists wonder about is where does consciousness come from? And some have tried, oh, it's just your brain. But in this book on breathing, they did a set of experiments years and years ago where they put this man, he was able to put himself into a deep sleep state where his brain was actually showing zero activity. But incredibly, he was able to recount in detail the conversations that went on in the room, even though his brain was registering zero activity. There's something there that's not simply our brain, something that's not simply awakens, something that gives us our sense of self, that the you that is you. Where does that come from? Something that doesn't change really as your body changes, because every cell in your body is replaced in a cycle. The complete cycle takes about 14 or 15 years. But your sense of you is still the same, even though every cell in your body has changed. Where does that come from? That consciousness. And if all we've got in the universe is matter, then all we are is this. That's all we've got. It's this stuff that doesn't breathe, that isn't conscious. But if there's a God who's conscious, there's a consciousness can be traced right back down to a God who is conscious. And we're made in his image. And it would make sense if a conscious God made people in his image that we would be conscious too. That fruit grows easily on our tree. We've got an answer to that. Third thing. One of the questions on the front of that magazine, again, why is there something rather than nothing? Where does consciousness come from? Where does our sense of right and wrong come from? I want to say that God is the foundation of right and wrong. We're made with a conscience. We'll be thinking more about that the next time we return to the Catechism. We're made with a conscience. We have a strong sense of right and wrong. And yes, we're shaped by our upbringing, but it's there before our upbringing. And again, I was reading a book called The Righteous Mind by an atheist called Jonathan Haidt. He talks about how there is something in it. He said, man is wired for righteousness. Experiments and tests done with babies show this. And he's wanting to know, where does this righteousness come from? This sense of right and wrong. Well, hold on, we know. We've got an answer. That fruit, good and evil, our sense of it, that would make sense if there was a God who is perfectly holy. In fact, we could even write on one of these roots, God is holy, God exists. I can't read it. God is conscious. All of those can be traced right down to here. Romans 2, 14 and 15, Paul writes, indeed, when Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature things required by the law, they are a law for themselves. Even though they do not have the law, they show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their consciences also bearing witness, and their thoughts sometimes accusing them, and at other times defending them. Now, I find it fascinating that our sense of right and wrong doesn't come from a culture of atheism. It doesn't make sense of it. Stephen Fry's outrage against God, where does he get his sense of right and wrong from? It was really interesting listening to an interview recently with a Chinese lady who had come from atheistic China, and she had been a convinced atheist, but now she's starting to investigate the Bible. And she had been listening to Richard Dawkins, and Richard Dawkins says something like, God is a capricious, moral monster. He is vindictive and spiteful. And she said, but you know, all of those are Christian objections. He has to be a Christian or to have grown up in a Christian culture to even raise those objections. If you grew up in China, where I grew up, you wouldn't notice those things. You would just say that's what a supreme being would do. They'd just be like that. Even Richard Dawkins has a strong moral sense in him that comes from A, his conscience, but B, his culture, the Christian culture that he's grown up in. Where does our sense of right and wrong come from? Our sense of justice? Maybe it's because we're made in the image of a God who is holy. Another fruit that grows on that tree, and we'll just touch on this one very, very briefly, is why are we relational beings? Or as the cover of the magazine asked the question, why do we grieve? Why do things upset us? I remember John Woodside saying about how he met a man who was a biologist, and this man said, I just believe that we are just matter. That's all you are. You're just matter. And we are determined by our genes, and that's all it is. And John Woodside said to him, that's very interesting. I see you have a young child there. If your young child goes out into the road and gets hit by a car, will you simply say, oh, look, his matter has been rearranged? I said, no, certainly not. And he was outraged at the thought, because he had an emotional connection. His child wasn't just matter to him. But where does that sense of connectedness and love and relationship come from? Well, the Bible tells us that there's a God who said, let us create. So he's a plurality in and of himself. And he's a God who loves within himself, and he's a God who communicates to his creatures, and he made man in his image so that he could talk to man, and man is the first of his creation that he speaks to. He speaks to. And so if we're made in the image of a God who is, if we're wondering where does love and relationship come from in our world, if all there is matter, but if we're made in the image of a God who is love, we're rooted in God's character and God's nature, that fruit makes sense. We would expect that fruit to grow on that tree. That would make sense. So God can the idea of God can explain why there's something rather than nothing, can explain why there's good and evil, why we're conscious, why we're loving, why relationships matter to us so much. The fifth one, God is the foundation for science, we might say, or a universe that is intelligible. That was another one of the questions on the magazine. Scientists believe that the universe is measurable and experiments can be done and predictions made. And yet, if it all happened randomly and accidentally, how can things be predictable in an accidental universe? How could something be done one day and exactly the same the next? And that's a question that bothers some scientists. Where did this order come from? One thing that perplexes them, and young people, you'll probably hate this unless you're like me and you love mathematics. I love maths. But scientists wonder, how does maths actually work in our universe? Maybe you've wondered the same thing. How does maths actually work? But that's different. They want to know, here's this thing that we can do on a page. And we can come up with ideas on a page. And then when we look at the universe, we find that the ideas we've had here actually work in the real world. How does that work? And I'll not even try to explain this to the younger children. Somebody sat down years ago and they were playing about with numbers, and they come up with the idea that we should be able to figure out the square root of negative numbers. Absolutely zero practical use, you would have thought. And then years later, they found that actually being able to compute the square root of negative numbers is at the very core of air traffic control. It had a real world application. They're going, wow, how did this theoretical idea that we thought had no use actually work in the real world? And scientists have no idea how it can be. They're puzzled by it. Here's a quote from one scientist. He wrote a paper called The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Natural Sciences. He said, the miracle of the appropriateness of the language of mathematics is a wonderful gift which we neither understand nor deserve. And yet, we'll just write science here. Science. What if there was a God who was ordered, and a God who didn't change, and a God who made things according to a plan and a pattern, and a God who was wise and intelligent? Would you not expect that fruit of science and an intelligible universe, that would grow on the tree that grows out of there being an intelligent God? John Lennox, Professor John Lennox of mathematics at Oxford, and he's from Armagh, is fond of saying that Renaissance scientists believed that there was order in nature because they believed that there was order in God. And so that drove them to seek the order in nature, to look for it. And they kept on, and they found it, and it made sense. So our very pursuit of science is based on the fact that there's a God. And how could we trust how is it that there's a world that can be investigated and we've got a brain that can do the investigating? There's something incredible there, that we live on a planet that can be investigated with an ability to investigate it. You don't have to believe in God to do science, but you can only explain science and how science can be done if there's a God. Number 6. So God is the foundation of an intelligible, a universe that we can investigate and discover. God is the foundation for complexity in nature. And we could spend weeks and weeks and weeks thinking about this, and we often have commented on it before. But if God is a God of wisdom and order and beauty, what might we expect to see? We not expect to see a universe that is full of wisdom and order and beauty. A universe that displays extraordinary precision. Another scientist, a man called Roger Penrose, I don't think he's any way religious or Christian, he said that the Big Bang must have been extraordinarily precise. Yet because everything is thermalized, in other words, just, it's so hot that everything's just completely atomized, thermalized, it will be completely random. Except for gravity, he said, which had to be very precise. So if you're going to have a theory, it has to account for why everything is random except this one thing. He's pointing out this doesn't quite stack up, does it? Extraordinary precision. You know, we're made up of molecules that are made up of atoms that are made up of protons and electrons, and those protons and electrons and neutrons are held together by forces. And if they were slightly stronger or slightly weaker, things would be very, very different. If we look at the stars around us, and the Bible has an easy line that says, and he also made the stars. And yet the stability of those stars depends on a very fine-tuned balance between electromagnetic forces and gravitational forces. And if the balance is out by a fraction, now the children can understand a fraction that is 1 in 10. That would be 1 over a 10. That would be a tenth. A tenth of a euro is 10 cents. A hundredth of a euro is 1 cent. That's 1 over 100. Imagine you had a number 1 over a number that had 1 and 40 zeros. That'd be a very small part of a euro, wouldn't it? Would you like to divide your money that way? And yet, if the balance between the electromagnetic forces and the gravitational forces was out by 1 part in 1 followed by 40 zeros, the consequences would be terrible. The universe would be unable to support life. And we could talk about the color, the brightness of the sun has to be just right so that things are right on the earth for photosynthesis. If we were a little bit closer to the sun, or a little bit further from the sun, things would be wrong. 2% further away, 2% closer. Too far away, the water will freeze. Too close, the water will evaporate. And yet we need water for life. There was evening and there was morning the first day. But there'd be no evening and morning unless the earth rotated. And if the speed of rotation wasn't just right, it starts to sound like Goldilocks and the Three Bears, doesn't it? You know, Big Bear's rotation was too fast. Mummy Bear's rotation was too slow. Baby Bear's rotation was just right. But it's called the Goldilocks paradox, or the Goldilocks thing. It's just right. If it was too fast, if it was too slow, the variation of temperature between day and night would be extreme. It's just right. If it was too fast, it would cause violent weather. And then there's the fact that we've got a magnetic core to the earth, and that protects us from harmful radiation, so it's not like living inside a microwave. Now, it just looks as if this planet was designed by a remarkably intelligent God. Here's another scientist, Francis Crick. He said, an honest man, armed with all the knowledge available to us now, could only state that in some sense, the origin of life appears to be almost a miracle. So many are the conditions which have had to have been satisfied to get it going. Another man, Fred Hoyle, a super intellect, has monkeyed with the physics as well as the chemistry and the biology. This world looks like it was designed by a God with infinite knowledge and wisdom. There are 6 foundations. I'm only going to mention 2 more. I'm not going to dig into them in any detail. God is the foundation for beauty and delight. Again, something that we're perplexed by. Why is it that across cultures we have a universal agreement about what is, on a broad scale, beautiful? Where does our sense of beauty come from? And yet, if we're made in the image of a God who delights to delight people, our sense of delight, a God who is generous and who loves to display his glory, our sense of being made to enjoy what's beautiful and glorious would make sense. An 8th one, God is the foundation of human rights. The UN Declaration of Human Rights. Our world is fixated on human rights. But where do human rights grow? What tree do they grow on? And a quote from Douglas Murray, who is he's an atheist as well, and he was just very blunt in saying, you know, where do people think they came from? They came from Christianity. Tom Holland says the same thing. The UN Declaration of Human Rights speaks about the recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of the members of the human family is the foundation of all freedom, justice, and peace in the world. Please show me your working out. Where does that come from? The American US Declaration of Independence says they're self-evident. They're self-evident. Really? Well, I think it was Tom Holland in an article in the Spectator magazine said the most radical statement in favor of human dignity in the ancient world comes in the book of Genesis. Human beings are created in the likeness and image of God. That fruit grows on our tree. That fruit grows on our tree. Another political thinker, Jesus Christ, had to come to earth to make it understood that all members of the human species are naturally alike and equal. Friedrich Nietzsche said, and he was famous for despising Christianity, another Christian concept has passed even more deeply into the tissue of modernity. The concept, what is this idea? The concept of the equality of souls before God. This furnishes the prototype of all theories of equal rights. So on and so on. And so we could give loads of examples that idea comes from the Bible. It grows on our tree. Again, last night I was listening to a podcast when I was driving, and Douglas Murray took part in a debate at Oxford. And I think the motion under debate was that religion wasn't necessary, had no place in the 21st century. On one side of the debate was Richard Dawkins and another guy called Andrew Copson. And they appeared to be winning the day until Douglas Murray got up to speak. He too was an atheist, but he was arguing for the other side. I said, that's a very awkward position to be in. Because first of all, I'm not in agreement with very much said by my own side most of the time, meaning the religious people. But I am on this side very uncomfortably because this statement, this house believes religion has no place in the 21st century, is to me as an atheist not just an overstatement, but it's wrong. And he goes on to give a whole host of reasons why it's wrong. And he said, if the 21st century is to work, religion will have a place. People can agree with Professor Dawkins and his colleagues, but no rational person could agree with this motion. Incredible. Here's somebody saying, and amongst the reasons that he gave, he talked about how human rights and so on all come from this. And so, what do we need God for? All of these fruit grow on our tree. Our world needs there to be a God, because our world enjoys all of the fruit that are here. And those fruit only grow on this tree. And more thinkers are beginning to discover. And so I want all of us. These things grow out of God's character. These things that are valued today grow on the tree that's rooted in the character of God. And I want us to have confidence that although the world may be telling you young people that you don't need God, and they're telling you to be kind, and they're telling you to be fair, and they're telling you to treat people as equals, where do they get those ideas from? God. And then they tell you that science disproves God and the Big Bang accounts for everything. Well, how do you do science? Well, you need there to be a God who's created a world that's stable and reliable and dependable and measurable and investigatable. And then they say to you, you should treat everybody as equals. Where does that idea come from? It comes from being made in the image of God. So I want all of us to have confidence that nothing makes sense without God. What do we need God for? Absolutely everything. There's one thing I haven't mentioned. What do we need God for? We need Him for salvation. Because you can look through all the religions of the world, and they're all about climbing up to the mountaintop to God by our efforts and our works. But Christianity tells us about the God who came down the mountain to us because He knew we could never climb the mountain. And we have this inbuilt sense of conscience that tells us that we're wrong. We know from the world around us that there's a God, and then we know that we're accountable to Him and are going to have to answer to Him. And what do we need God for? We need God because we're not able to answer for the lives that we've lived. And we need God to provide a solution to the problem that we've got. And thankfully, that's what He does. And it's in Jesus Christ, not only do we find intellectual answers, but we find heart answers. And the God who would lay down His life for us so that we could know Him and enjoy Him forever. Amen.